If you want a single sentence for this hour, here it is. The past keeps moving, but sometimes it leaves a clear trail. Tonight, you and I are going to follow 6 of those trails from 2025. We will not claim final truth. We will follow what was reported, what was excavated, and what the evidence appears to suggest, and we will leave space for the parts that are still unknown. Think of this as a guided walk told to one person. I am telling it to you. We will build toward the strongest reveal. So if you stay with me, the last discovery will feel earned. Along the way, I will keep returning to the same question. What does each find actually tell us, and what does it not? Let us begin with a place where the ground itself holds a story that took decades to find. Discovery 1, Caracol and the First Ruler. High in the jungles of Belize, the ancient Maya city of Caracol has been excavated for decades. It does not feel like a single site. It feels like a whole landscape with plazas, causeways, and layers of rebuilding. In 2025, researchers announced a tomb that they described as belonging to an early ruler, possibly the founder of Caracol's dynasty. The find includes rich offerings, and the claim is careful. The tomb is consistent with an early royal burial and fits the broader historical timeline for the city. It is important to hear the caution in that word, consistent. This is not a certainty. It is an argument based on context, date, and material. What makes this discovery powerful is not only the name attached to it. It is what the tomb reveals about how early Maya kingship might have been established. If this person really was an early ruler, then the objects in the tomb tell us about alliances, about trade, and about how the Maya elite signaled legitimacy. You can imagine the ceremonial logic, precious materials, symbolic forms, and a burial designed to endure. A tomb is not only a grave, it is a message. This is where we slow down and ask what the message is. First, it says Caracol was not a minor settlement. It was already participating in a world of power. Second, it suggests that early Maya rulers were connected across long distances, either through trade or diplomacy or both. The evidence for those connections can be subtle, a style of ceramic, the source of a mineral, the shape of a mask. None of those things prove a story on their own, but together, they suggest a network. There is another layer. A tomb is also a story about memory. The people who built it were deciding what should be remembered. In that sense, the discovery is not just about the person inside. It is about the choices of the living. And that is a theme we will return to tonight. The past we recover is always the past someone chose to leave behind. Caracol also reminds us that archaeology is patient work. What looks like a single find in a headline is often the result of decades of mapping, excavation, and analysis. That slow pace can be hard to notice when you see a photograph of a jeweled mask or a chamber, but the slowness is part of the truth. It is how the story is built. So our first discovery teaches us something about early power, about regional networks, and about the intentional construction of memory. It also sets the mood. 2025 was not only about dramatic artifacts, but about the stories those artifacts allow us to carefully, cautiously propose. Hold that idea, because the next discovery is the opposite of careful, quiet memory. It is loud, metallic, and hidden. Under the sea. Discovery 2, the WRICKS of Iron Bottom Sound. There is a stretch of ocean near Guadalcanal known as Iron Bottom Sound. The name comes from the naval battles of World War II, where ships and lives were lost in extraordinary numbers. For years, many of those wrecks were unlocated or only partially documented. In 2025, new surveys and remotely operated vehicles mapped and identified additional wrecks with greater precision. At first glance, this may seem different from ancient archaeology, but it is the same method applied to a different time, evidence on the seafloor, careful documentation, and a story that needs reconstruction. The questions here are not about myth. They are about logistics, decisions, and the human cost of battle. What does a shipwreck tell us that a written record cannot? It tells us where the ship actually ended. It shows us damage patterns. It reveals the moment of failure. It can even show us the path of a vessel in its final minutes. That is a kind of truth that is not always preserved on paper. Yet even here, we must be cautious. A wreck can show us how something broke, but it does not show us the decisions that led to that break. It does not show us fear or courage. It shows us metal and physics. The human story must still be reconstructed through multiple kinds of evidence. So why include this in an archaeology episode? Because archaeology is not only about ancient temples, it is about material traces and what they allow us to understand. In 2025, the mapping of these wrecks sharpened historical detail. It also reminded us that the past includes events that still live in memory, in family stories, and in national identity. There is a continuity here with our first discovery. Both involve memory, but in Caracol, memory was built in iron. Bottom Sound, memory is recovered. One is a deliberate message from the past. The other is a silent object we must interpret without intention. This difference matters because it changes how we tell the story. We can confirm the location and condition of a ship, but we still need humility when we talk about meaning. We can show the wreck. We cannot claim to have the whole story. Now we turn back to the ancient world, but with a twist. The next discovery is not a tomb or a city. It is a port. Submerged and still debated, connected to one of the most famous figures in history. The key word is connected. Discovery 3, Taposiris Magna, and a port underwater. Cleopatra attracts attention for a reason. She sits at the edge of two worlds, the last Ptolemaic ruler and a symbol of Egypt's long transformation. For years, archaeologists have searched for her burial site, and the site known as Taposiris Magna has been one of the main candidates. In 2025, reports described underwater discoveries that appear to be part of a port structure in the area, adding another layer of context to the search. Notice the language, appear to be, add context, candidate. That is the right tone. We do not have Cleopatra's tomb. We have evidence that may help explain how this coastal region functioned. A port is not the tomb, but it is part of the story of the place. It tells us how goods and people moved. It tells us that the area was active and that the sea was a working partner, not a boundary. Why does that matter? Because the search for Cleopatra is not only about one person, it is about a late period in which Egypt was deeply connected to the Mediterranean. Ports are the architecture of that connection. If you want to understand the late Ptolemaic world, you have to understand the trade routes, the shipping lanes, and the coastal infrastructure that kept the economy alive. This is also a reminder that archaeology is often about context. A tomb without context can be misleading. A port without context can be misinterpreted. But together, these pieces can create a map of how a region worked. And there is a human element here that is easy to miss. Coastal sites are fragile, shorelines shift, earthquakes and storms reshape the seabed. When you find a submerged structure, you are not only finding an ancient port, you are finding evidence of environmental change. That means this discovery is also a quiet story about nature. It would be easy to treat this as a mystery episode and stop there. But we are doing something more careful. The story is not Cleopatra was found. The story is we learned more about the landscape where she might have been. That is still interesting. It is still meaningful. It is also honest. Now we move away from the sea and back to the mountains, to a discovery that looks like a strange scar across the land. Discovery 4. The Andes, the band of holes, and the land as tool. If you ever fly over parts of the Andes, you see patterns that do not look natural. Long lines, repeating shapes, geometric marks that seem too regular to be random. One of the most striking is the band of holes, a long line of thousands of small pits carved into a hillside. Archaeologists have debated its purpose for years. In 2025, further analyses and imaging reinforced the idea that this feature was not an accident of geology, but a constructed system. The most common interpretation is that it was used for storage or as part of a resource management strategy, possibly related to state control of goods. Again, careful language matters. It is a likely interpretation, not a proven fact, but even as a hypothesis, it tells us something important. Andean societies did not only build in stone, they built in the landscape itself. The land was a tool. It was shaped to hold, to guide, to organize. This is a different form of architecture. It is not a temple. It is a system of management, and it asks us to expand our sense of what a city or a civilization looks like. Not everything is a skyline. Sometimes the most complex infrastructure is spread across hillsides and valleys. There is also a social story embedded here. If those holes were for storage, then someone decided how the storage was used. That implies authority. It implies a bureaucracy. It implies a shared system of trust. It is the same pattern we see in Sumer and in Egypt. Organization leaves physical traces. In the Andes, those traces are enormous and quiet. If you walk along the line, you see repetition. But that repetition is not mindless. It is the signature of planning, and planning is a form of power. So this discovery adds a new dimension to our list. Not just objects, but landscapes. Not just artifacts, but the systems that produced them. And that prepares us for the two largest and most consequential discoveries on this list. Both from Egypt, both from 2025, and both capable of changing how we think about a civilization. We will start with the one that feels like a classic archaeological headline. Discovery 5, the tomb of Thutmose II. For nearly a century, the Valley of the Kings has been synonymous with royal burial. The discovery of Tutankhamun shaped the entire public imagination of Egypt. In 2025, researchers announced the identification of a tomb linked to Thutmose II. The claim is that this is a royal burial associated with a pharaoh whose tomb had not been confirmed in the valley. The details are still being studied and debated, and that is important. This is an identification based on archaeological evidence, inscriptions, and context, not a simple label. Why does this matter? Because it fills a gap in the royal landscape. If the identification holds, it provides a new anchor for understanding the 18th dynasty and the sequence of burials in the valley. It also suggests that even in a well-studied area, the archaeological record is not complete. You can feel the tension here. How can a place so famous still hold something new? The answer is that excavation is not only about digging, it is about interpretation. A tomb can be found and still not fully understood. It can be present for years before the evidence is read in a new way. This discovery also reminds us that we are looking at a political system that carefully curated memory. Royal tombs were not just burials, they were statements. They positioned a king within a lineage. They connected him to the gods and to the land. When we identify a tomb, we are not only finding a body, we are finding a deliberate message about power. If you were to stand in that valley, you would feel the weight of continuity, but you would also feel the gaps. This discovery speaks to one of those gaps. It says, there is still room for surprise even in places that feel fully known. Hold on to that feeling, because our final discovery is less dramatic in a visual sense, but larger in a scientific one. It deals with a person, not a monument, and it changes what can be known. Discovery 6, an ancient Egyptian genome. In 2025, researchers reported what they described as one of the oldest and most complete ancient Egyptian genomes. The remains came from a site in Middle Egypt and were dated to roughly 4,500 to 4,800 years ago. The exact dates and interpretations are still part of a careful scientific process, but the significance is clear. Genetic data can add a new layer to the story of Egypt's population history. Why is this such a powerful discovery? Because it is not about a single artifact or a single tomb. It is about the biological record itself. DNA can tell us about ancestry, about movement, and about how populations changed over time. It does not tell us everything. It cannot tell us language or culture directly, but it can set boundaries on what is plausible. This is where humility is essential. Genetics is not a simple story. It is a statistical one. It is a map of relationships, not a narrative. And yet, it can challenge older assumptions and refine our understanding of how Egypt was connected to surrounding regions. The key point is this: this kind of data does not replace archaeology. It complements it. It is another lens, another tool, and like any tool, it must be used carefully. We do not claim that a single genome represents all Egyptians. We only claim that it adds evidence to the larger discussion. If you are listening closely, you can see how this discovery completes our arc. We began with a tomb in the jungle, moved through shipwrecks, ports, and landscapes, and arrived at a single human body whose cells carry a story that no temple wall could preserve. It is a reminder that the past is not only in objects, but in people. This is why I saved it for last. It is the quietest discovery, but it is the one that changes the deepest assumptions. It turns the question from what did they build to who were they? That is a powerful shift. Conclusion: what these finds actually tell us If you look back over this hour, a pattern emerges. Each discovery is a piece of evidence. None of them is a final answer. Each one reshapes the story slightly. That is how history really works. It is not a single revelation. It is a slow accumulation of careful corrections. The Caracol tomb suggests early Maya kingship was organized and connected. The shipwrecks remind us that material evidence can correct written memory. The submerged port near Taposiris Magna adds context to a search that is still unfinished. The band of holes shows that a landscape can be engineered as a system. The tomb linked to Thutmose II fills a gap in royal lineage, and the ancient Egyptian genome adds a biological dimension to the story of a civilization. Each of these finds pushes against a different kind of assumption. They do not replace the old stories. They refine them, and that refinement is what makes archaeology so powerful. It is a discipline of humility. The past is always larger than our current map of it. So if you take one thing from this hour, let it be this: the best discoveries do not just excite us, they change the questions we ask next. They make us better at listening to silence, to fragments, and to the parts that are still missing. That is the real value of the biggest finds of 2025. Not that they solved history, but that they made it clearer and more precise, one careful step at a time.